speaker. All right. So we have Dr. Mawani. I'll repeat that. He also has a Bachelor of Science and from the University of Western Ontario and his BA from the University of Alberta. He received additional training at the Mind Body Medical Institute at Harvard University in Boston. And additionally, Dr. Mawani continues to enhance his skills through seeking out different areas of practice that can enhance the services he provides. This includes learning about and incorporating principles of positive psychology into his practice. Dr. Mawani currently works primarily in private practice. He's also an adjunct professor with the U of C Department of Psychology. He consults to large private healthcare facilities in managing mental health issues in the workforce. He was previously a clinical psychology program practicum training supervisor.
That's enough. That's enough.
and a Calgary clinical psychology at a Calgary clinical and a Calgary clinical psychology residency program supervisor for 10 years. So we know he's very qualified, very qualified. He's an active member of the Canadian Psychological Association and the Psychological Association of Alberta. Tonight, the topic is mindfulness and loneliness. And to me, this feels like a very timely topic because I recently listened to a podcast with U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. And if any of you have had a chance to listen to him, he's just so well-spoken and so passionate. He's really a wonderful man. And he's very dedicated to this strong call of reducing loneliness and its contribution to what is several health crises in the U.S. And he said, and this is really good, he's quoted here, "Our relationships are a source of healing and well-being hiding in plain sight, one that can help us live healthier, more fulfilled, and more productive lives." And this was interesting. I'm going to share this, and maybe you are too, but the physical health consequences of poor or insufficient connection include a 29% increased risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke, and a 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. And additionally, lacking social connection increases risk of premature death by more than 60%. So it seems all very compelling. So when we think about that in the physical body, there's also, in addition to that, loneliness and isolation contribute substantially to mental health challenges. In adults, the risk of developing depression among people who report feeling lonely often is more than double that for people who rarely or never feel lonely, which is just so significant.
Those estimates, by the way, those estimates are conservative too. I mean, you can look at a whole bunch of studies and they will give you higher estimates than that. I mean, there's a reason, I don't want to jump in, but there's a reason why, many countries have called loneliness an epidemic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And so I think that is such a call, and I offer those statistics just to really emphasize like the importance of this discussion and what you're bringing us and how really it's our time to help ourselves and how can we work on this epidemic of loneliness. They say it's, we have all these social media efforts, but we're more lonely than we ever have been. So with that, I turn to you for some positive solutions for us.
Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Mawani. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. And I always appreciate the invite to be here. So, and thank you for each of you for taking the time to be here. It's kind of interesting that we would talk about loneliness because it's so important that we be here together, right? But as we're going to talk about it in a second, you can be in a crowd and still be lonely. And so there are very loose correlations between the number of people that we have around us and our experience of loneliness. Before I go too far down the road, though, I want to maybe just, I know we're recording this. I'm going to try and ignore that, to be honest with you, just because it's, so I'll talk to you. I often find that when I'm speaking, it goes much better if this can be a conversation. And so please feel free, don't wait until the end. If there's something that I'm talking about that you want me to expand on, or if there's something that you feel is of particular interest, please feel free. You can put up your hand, and blurt it out if you like. I'll try to stop talking and let you, yeah, have some space. But it's much better when it's a conversation, not a monologue. And some of you I recognize from times when I've been here before, and you'll know that I do my best to actually do that. So I invite that. I invite you to engage in this material and with me. Okay. And maybe even just to start in that vein, if I could have maybe one or two brave souls, what brought you here? What was it that you wanted to know more about? If you have any question that you feel would be useful, can't say that I'll answer it, but I want to hear the questions. Anybody?
When you talked about, when you said about loneliness, I just lost my wife. And so that's the really tragic times that I have to go through them. So it's easier said done, said, yes, get over with it, but you can never get over it.
Yeah.
So that's why it's kind of something to feel more where you can take that.
Perfect, thank you. So just to capture that, loneliness and loss, and you mentioned losing someone very close to you, and it's very easy for people to say, just, move on, right? But that is just not the case. And there's actually a piece in the literature around grief and loss, but also in some of the newer literature talking about loneliness that I think is particularly relevant to that. So I will do my best to expand on that. So thank you, and my condolences for the loss. Thank you. Yeah, okay, 1, 2, thank you. Oh, we got perfect. I got lots of people. Thank you.
For me, it's more mindful, more aware. I think more awareness I have of habits from the past that I would see that the things that I would do to avoid them,
Yeah.
to keep myself so busy, to be so distracted, to fill.
Yeah.
And when I look back, I go, really, what was that truly about? Why? And I think sitting down, like we need to start meditating.
Yeah.
A few years ago, 5 minutes, felt like, how could I be so disconnected from myself?
Yes.
And I think the root of it was almost this avoidance of being with myself,
Yes.
which is ultimate loneliness.
Yeah. So would you like to, you want to come sit here? Because totally, that is so central.
And then the discomfort.
Yes.
Feel it.
Yes.
Like, wow.
Yes.
No wonder I went to all that way.
Yes.
To avoid.
Yes. So thank you for that. So just again for those purposes. So the awareness that arises, right, when we start to meditate and we start to pay attention, and then you start to be aware of the patterns you're talking about, right? And those patterns of trying to avoid the emotional experience of loneliness and starting to appreciate, why was I engaged in that? And what has been the impact of that across the many years that I was doing that before I realized I was doing that? And I want to really reinforce that, right? You don't do it consciously. You don't do it knowingly, but you do it. And there are so many different influences on that. I can't even put my finger on all of them, right? There are so many different influences on that, but that's what if I can capture, part of what you're talking about and part of what brought you here is that, what role does mindfulness play in all of this? And, that idea of awareness that we can gain from mindfulness, helping us to appreciate those patterns, but also appreciate the nature of avoidance and why I would want to avoid in the first place.
And then develop the ability.
Yeah.
To sit with it.
Yeah.
To be with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And mindfulness being a part of that process too, right?
So
Yeah,
I'm
totally.
looking for those nuggets around developing that capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, one more. Yes, please.
Oh, yeah. Of late, I have been a huge fan of Eckhart Tolle.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
he speaks a lot about mindfulness. he does not use the word mindfulness.
No, he doesn't.
Persons,
Yes.
that's what he uses.
Yes.
So I am a registered social worker as well, and I think intellectually and conceptually, I think I have come about the benefits of mindfulness, how to lead a mindful life, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to the practice, I have found it very hard. Right, so the gap between the intellectual and the conceptual understanding of the benefits of mindfulness, everything, I am convinced of. But at the practical level, the implementation level,
Yes.
I totally feel.
Yes.
So I'm just trying to understand, others, maybe listen to others' experience and your words. How can I, even if I cannot bridge the gap, at least how can I reduce the gap?
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So trying to bridge the gap between the conceptual and the actual practical part,
Exactly, yeah.
right? Sort of like that moment to moment experience that I have and how hard it is to be present with myself
Exactly, yeah.
and trying to figure out, okay, what does that gap look like and how do I bring it into the moment? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. But you also touched on something else, which is, you said that you're convinced, right? You know that mindfulness can be beneficial.
I won't argue with it.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
personally convinced this helps.
Yes.
And its benefits,
Yes,
but, the practice, it happens through daily practices, right?
yes.
That's it.
Yes. So so this is a StatsCan, and I love Canadian statistics when we can get them, right? So this is StatsCan. I've got a couple of copies here that you can take a look at. Thank you. This was a summary of StatsCan research, in the last probably 5 years, looking at levels of loneliness in Canada. And it will help to amplify what Christine was talking about in terms of the fact that, there are many people who are experiencing loneliness, and those numbers are only going up, unfortunately. And how is it that we can live in such a connected world and yet still find levels of loneliness going up? And I don't know necessarily that I'll be able to answer that question, but I also want to start to bridge that. Bridge that understanding, because I think it helps us. It's an interesting dilemma, and it helps us to maybe take a deeper dive into why that might be. To start with, actually, maybe if I can, just to iterate something you just said, this is not clinical advice. I'm a clinical psychologist, but this is not clinical advice. This is a general talk, not to be replacing any kind of professional advice if you need it. And if you are experiencing or if you're listening to this and you are experiencing loneliness at a level that it is really disturbing to you, then please reach out, do something about it. Okay? Yeah.
Can you go a little louder?
Louder. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Please. Yes. Tell me to speak up. Tell me to speak up.
Maybe an additional question, more organized subjects, the stats. What is loneliness?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is?
Yeah. Perfect. That's the first line.
I have really very 5 good friends over the phone,
Yes.
and that's it.
Yes.
But I'm, let's say, really not that close to someone
Yes.
physically.
Yes.
Is that loneliness? Or
Perfect.
is the feeling?
So thank you. So what is loneliness, right? And that's a great place to start. That's exactly where I was going to start. So thank you for leading me in, and I'll give you $10 later for helping me lead into that. What is loneliness? So you'll find different definitions out there, but I think at a fundamental level, loneliness is a perceived discrepancy. It's a perceived discrepancy between the kind of connections that I want and the kind of connections that I have. And so there is no objective measure. It is very subjective, and it is a felt experience, not an objective experience. Now, having said that, we also know that there are very specific areas of the brain that start to light up and create patterns in the brain when people are experiencing lonely moments. And so I don't want to leave it at this sort of ethereal kind of, it's an emotional experience. No, it is also reflected in the way that the brain operates. I'm not going to get into the which leads to which, right? Enough to say that it is about the perceived discrepancy. And so if I feel that the kinds of social connections that I have are not meeting my needs, then I am likely to experience loneliness. Okay, now, a lot of people think of loneliness as an interpersonal experience, but I'm going to suggest over the course of the talk today that it is not just an interpersonal experience, it is an intrapersonal experience as well. And what I mean by that is my ability to be with myself or inability to be with myself is a part of the experience of loneliness. And to go back to your question, the concept that I want to maybe introduce into the conversation is one of social homeostasis. So as human beings, we are organisms that are striving to meet homeostasis, maintain homeostasis. And that is at a biological level. Startling, isn't it? Yeah. That is at a biological level, that is at a psychological level, that is at a social level. And I would say spiritual level as well, but we'll leave that one aside for now. And so social homeostasis is this idea that we have this varying set point. And I made mention in my introduction that we would touch a little bit on the impact of COVID. And I think this is one of the things that we started to really look at when we started to enter into COVID and we had this physical distancing. And what we found was that our homeostasis started to change. Our set point, we got accustomed to less social interactions, and that then changed our set point. I want to think of this in a few different ways though, right? I mean, think about your own experience. How many people here have had times where you were engaged in a social interaction and it was actually more than what you were seeking and it was overwhelming? Just think about that, right? We can find it overwhelming even being in amongst a group. At the same time, we can find moments where we are lonely because we are seeking more social interaction. And maybe rather than thinking about it in terms of a set level, we can think about it in terms of where we are in relation to this homeostasis that we are become accustomed to. And so if we have been through a period of relative low contact, then we might be seeking more. And so our brain will put us into a search mode where we will want to reach out to people and connect with people that we know, maybe even people that we want to meet. If we've had this period where we've had a lot of social contact, we're finding it overwhelming, maybe we want less. And so this idea of social homeostasis, I think, is an interesting one because it allows us to have some variability in terms of how much social contact we want, how much social contact we might desire and need, and understand that in a way that is more dynamic than having coffee with one or two friends once a week, and that should be enough, right? So this idea of social homeostasis, when you lose somebody who is close to you, especially when they're a spouse or a partner, your homeostasis level just got thrown out of whack. And of course, you're going to feel that. Your brain is designed to experience that, and then to send up signals saying something's happening here and you need to pay attention to it. That doesn't mean that something is wrong. What it means is that you're being thrown out of homeostasis, and now you have to find some way of reestablishing a level of homeostasis, which will not be what it was. Does that make sense? Yeah. And in that transition period, it can be very disarming because we've gotten used to this pattern and we like our patterns. We like homeostasis. And so when we're thrown out of that, it can be very disarming. And especially when there's loss involved, this is where we can sometimes start to experience loneliness. So it is this perceived discrepancy, not that we're making it up, but more so that we are the ones that get to adjudicate that. We get to judge that as to whether there's more or less, enough, not enough. And of course, there's many factors that will feed into this, right? There's personality factors, this idea of introversion, extroversion, which I won't be able to get into too much today, but I want to touch on because, this idea that that if you're an introvert, that you are okay alone, which I think there's some merit to that idea, but I don't think that that is the entire story. Introverts, the way that I would understand it, and part of my training when I was in grad school was in Jungian psychology as well, is that introverts are not about being alone, but they are about deriving their energy and their sense of replenishment from having a few but very deep and meaningful connections. So notice baked into there, we need this sense of connection with others. It's just for introverts, it's few people that I have deep, meaningful connections with, right? Extroverts, on the other hand, they derive their energy from being amongst lots of people. They enjoy being the sound of the party. And they enjoy and they gather energy and they replenish by that. Rather than thinking of these things as two separate entities, I think it is far more helpful to look at this as a continuum. And that we can sit somewhere in that continuum. And in fact, we might even move on that continuum as we go through the developmental stages of life, not just childhood and adolescence, but throughout life. And our needs might change, and where we see ourselves and how we perceive ourselves might change as well. And so our needs are going to evolve. And this is why I like that idea of homeostasis, because it allows us a way of being flexible around that. By the way, that is not my term. That is a term that was coined by others. I think Dr. Kay Tai, I think, is one of the people that has really started to use that, that language of homeostasis. So personality types being a part of that, but also, our environment also being a part of that. If we grew up in a family that had lots of siblings, lots of cousins, lots of aunts and uncles, and some cultures have also, there is the family gatherings a lot, right? That is also going to impact our homeostasis level in terms of how much interaction we are accustomed to, how much we feel we need, how much we feel we want. And then that too will also be impacted if we start to see changes, whether it be because we moved and now we're not as connected with our families, or whether it's because we have families who are more in contact with us. Yes, please.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when you were exactly the same thing, right? I mean, I was surrounded by so many people, family, and when I moved here, it was totally the opposite.
Right.
So what was that way of homeostasis that completely changed? Right?
Yes.
So just thinking about that when you mentioned that.
Yes. Yes. So the comment being that, that you were accustomed to that. And then when you moved, all of that all of a sudden wasn't available anymore. And really feeling that shift in homeostasis, right? And thank you for that, because we can experience that shift and it doesn't require loss. It can be, those people are still there. And there may be different ways of connecting with them, but those ways are not quite the same. And we do have some evidence to say that it is different when we are connecting with people in person versus over video versus social media. Right? And so these connections are not the same. And this might help us to also appreciate, something that we touched on earlier, which is how is it that we can live in such a highly interconnected world and still have loneliness levels that are on the rise. And in some respects, that is because, we talk about homeostasis. I also like to use the analogy of a diet. Our diet has evolved. And maybe our diet hasn't evolved in the best of ways. That's an opinion that I hold, but as we have perhaps moved from in-person contact to connecting over social media, which might be easier and we can connect with more people, but maybe that is not as nutritious for us in terms of our levels of social connectivity and meaningful connections. And maybe this is a part of why it is that we're starting to see loneliness levels, well, not starting, but have been seeing loneliness levels increase. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I guess one of the things that I would invite you to do is to look at where you derive your connectivity from and be deliberate and discerning about how and who you connect with in order to make sure that you are nourishing yourself with connections that are meaningful and that are going to be fulfilling to you and your psyche, if you will. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. All of this is based in the premise that we are wired for connectivity. We're wired for it. You know, the brain, there's all sorts of bad things that happen in the brain when we do not have available connections. When we force people into isolation, you know, it can be horrible for the brain. And in fact, you know, when we do that in early childhood, in some respects, the attachments that are lost can be at times irreparable. And so this idea of being wired for connectivity and there being a fundamental drive to connect to others, and then with all of the personality pieces and the cultural pieces, the societal pieces, the familial pieces, you know, all of that influencing what that looks like, we're wired for it. And so not being able to is going to impact us at a very deep biological level as well.
Can I ask a question about this?
Please, yeah.
When it comes to the various, you know, we got a lot in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Do the left and right temporal lobes affect loneliness?
So I'm not going to be able to answer that question specifically, just because I'm not aware of current research looking at the specifics of left and right temporal lobes in the role of loneliness. However, I will say that the experience of loneliness, I understand it to be a distributed function. And so it is not just those lobes that are involved, because we've got underlying subcortical level areas that are also involved. For example, one of the things that researchers are looking at is brainstem activity. So there's an area of the brain called the nucleus of Raffi. And areas in that part of the brain being differentially activated based on people's identification of loneliness. And so, yes, I think it's feasible, probable, but I don't know necessarily that we want to isolate and localize it to those areas, because it's a distributed function. That's the way that I would understand it. Now, not being a neuropsychologist or a neurobiologist, it's not my primary area of research. I'm going to defer to those experts for more specific answers. But again, right, that you know, limbic and base of the brain areas are involved in this experience as well. And so we know that it's a distributed function. Does that make sense? I know I'm not answering your question, but hopefully that also tells you that it's probably more than just left and right parietal lobes. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So what about mindfulness? So far, we talked a lot about loneliness. What about mindfulness? And I'm going to go back to your comment. Your comment was, as I started to develop my practice of mindfulness and I became more aware, correct me where I'm wrong, you started to identify patterns of behavior that you might have engaged in the past unknowingly, that were either contributing to or a result of wanting to avoid the experience of loneliness. Is that fair? And I think this is something that we're seeing in the literature more and more. This idea that it is more and more difficult for us to be able to sit with ourselves. This idea that being able to sit with ourselves is a skill, and to be able to allow, and I would say mindfully accept, what we find when we are quiet. And I would again ask you to reflect on your own experience through your day. How many opportunities do you have for quiet. There are fewer and fewer opportunities for us to be quiet, not be bombarded by emails and texts and phone calls and all of the other things that sort of inundate us that prevent us from being able to be quiet alone with ourselves and find some comfort with that. Research looking at the way that people are find it very aversive, actually, to sit quietly by themselves. And those statistics, again, are going up as well. And so for me, this is one of those places where mindfulness plays such a central role. And I just brought this article, which is a recent meta-analysis looking at the role of mindfulness in loneliness. And if anybody wants to see it, you're welcome to take a look. This is just one of a few different articles that you can find, sort of talking about how there's a growing body of literature looking at mindful practices of various types. So there's mindfulness-based stress reduction, compassion-based mindfulness practices, mindfulness and yoga, looking at the way that mindful practices, even over the course of 2 weeks or 8 weeks, having a beneficial impact in reducing levels of reported loneliness in people who participate in those practices. And I think a part of what is happening there is that through the practice, not only are we becoming more aware of our patterns, but we're also learning how we can sit, and I call it mindful acceptance to differentiate it from the generic form of acceptance, which I'm going to differentiate in a second, how we can sit in a mindfully accepting way with whatever it is that we find at the physiological level, at the psychological level, at the emotional level, at the cognitive level, and even at the social level. And so I want to unpack that a little bit, but then I want to get to a practice. Okay. This idea that acceptance, and I get this a lot in my clinical practice, and which is one of the reasons why I call it mindful acceptance, we tend to conflate or mix together the idea of acceptance and liking. So I've had a number of people who say, oh, so what you're talking about is whatever it is that I'm trying to accept, I have to like it. No, never said you had to like it. It turns out we can accept things that we do not like. Liking ends up being a part of the judging that can then add to the suffering that we experience attached to whatever it is that we are working with in the moment. And to go back to that, where we started, which was the definition of loneliness, it is a subjective experience, right? And so in being a subjective experience, if I judge what I find, it is going to amplify the distress attached to that loneliness. So that's the first thing. I differentiate mindful acceptance from regular, what most people would consider to be acceptance, in terms of it doesn't require liking. The other distinction that I would make is mindful acceptance also does not require resignation. This is not about it will always be this way and it'll never change. Mindfulness is about how do I learn to be with, accepting, acknowledging, allowing the experience of the moment without projecting into the future. And if you think about it, that has impact for loneliness as well. Because it isn't just that I am alone in this moment, it is the thought that I will be alone for the foreseeable future or into the future, or in extreme terms, forever. This is a part of what can bring distress when we are finding ourselves alone and lonely, and the two are different. Alone does not equate with loneliness, and loneliness does not equate with alone, right? And so that idea of projecting that into the future and saying it's going to be like this forever can also add to the level of distress. And that subjective sense of feeling lonely. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. How about, please ask questions. As I mean, I can talk forever, but I want to speak to you, not just necessarily talk about what I have written down on my notes.
Question.
Yeah, please.
In the, and if you don't know this, I'm happy to read the study.
Yeah, that's okay.
Learning about these things as well. But is there, like, in the meta-analysis of the different methods for looking at loneliness, is there something in particular that was a study that showed, besides kind of basic mindfulness of acceptance, a sort of meditation or mindfulness practice or compassion practice or something particular that was more helpful for loneliness?
So I think based on my read of the literature, I think whether it be mindfulness from a more traditional standpoint of MBSR or whether it be compassion-based mindfulness practices, they've both been shown to be helpful. Okay. Sometimes the studies are not specific about the type of meditative practice that they might invite, or they're not specific and consistent about it. There are various types of mindfulness practices that a person might participate in over the course of the study. But one of the things that I have picked out is, and this is actually a nice quick, because it leads me into my next point, which is I would like to consider mindfulness in two ways. One, how can I be at ease with myself? And two, how can I use mindfulness to build more enriching relationships? And I don't think that there is a specific practice that one sort of needs to do in order to do that. I think that that can be achieved in a variety of different ways. Does that make sense? But those would be two of the, I'm not saying those are the intents and that's where the research is. I'm just saying those are two things that I have picked out of probably a bunch of different things that I think one can link to that have been shown to improve one's sense of connectedness and reduce levels of loneliness. And so those two things. One, how to be at ease with oneself. And this is where, you know, that idea of mindfulness being an approach to oneself. How do I invite in the various thoughts, emotions, sensations that I am experiencing in the moment, and be at ease with whatever it is that that moment brings. To use an analogy, so my dissertation work was in the world of chronic pain. And the role of mindfulness in chronic pain management has sort of really grown over the last 20 years. But one of the things that I get when I'm working with people with chronic pain, especially early on in the process, is I'm going to invite you to pay attention to the moment. And they're like, what, are you crazy? Maybe someone forgot to tell you that I'm here because I'm in pain. It's like, yes, I know that. Because one of the things that we can learn is how to relate differently to our pain. Even at a physiological level, we can learn to relate differently to the sensation of pain. And I would suggest that expanding from that, we can learn to relate differently to the experience of the emotion of pain. And to the emotion of loneliness, which is painful. And learning how to relate differently, to use John Kabat-Zinn's words, can change it completely. And so being able to do that, being able to appreciate that this is about changing the way that I might relate to myself, my patterns, the way that I react to emotions that I have called bad or not good or don't like them, which is all judging, right? And maybe even be able to invite those in and be present and work within the context of being at ease with those things. This becomes a part of how I can be at ease with myself and my own experience. I'm going to touch on this real quick, but I want to get in practice. How am I doing for time, by the way, Christine?
It is 7:56.
So how long do I have?
How long do you want?
How patient are you? It's the question. Well, by time, what am I supposed to?
Well, we like to leave time for questions.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, that weird. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Can I just mention something about pain?
Yeah,
I've
please.
done a lot of research on the brain.
Yeah.
When it comes to pain, the only reason we feel pain, the brain is letting us know something's wrong, you gotta fix it.
Right.
So you can actually train your brain to just make that pain a lot less.
Yeah.
Just make it, what's the word? Just make it
Well, what we would say is that, you know, we can retrain ourselves to understand that pain as to be a signal.
oh, yeah, there's a good one, yeah.
Right. It's a signal, right? And in some respects that is the, you know, part of the analogy, right? Is that I have physical pain. This is a signal from my body, although it is, you know, there is some question about that. And it is a signal telling me, pay attention because something is not quite right.
You can really reduce the pain
Right.
and
Right.
just let the brain know.
And if you look at it that way, the pain signaling is also a way of representing that you are out of homeostasis. So find ways of bringing yourself back into homeostasis. Right? But at a loneliness level, it's very similar, I think. The signal of loneliness is about you're out of homeostasis. And do something to bring yourself back into homeostasis. Reach out, connect. And in fact, what we find is that the experience of loneliness is connected to parts of the brain that actually drive that kind of behavior. Those motivational systems, those drive systems get activated in the brain in order to get us more active in terms of reaching out to people and doing things that are going to help us to feel more connected, because it's a signal that I'm no longer in homeostasis. So thank you, because that's the analogy that I wanted to create. Yes.
As a massage therapist, I believe in body-mind connection, and how many times I've seen patients with pain in their bodies, and I tell them that it's your body's telling you there's something wrong,
Mhm.
and our emotions get trapped into our muscles,
Mhm.
and I think a lot of times I will see people who are lonely,
Mhm.
but they're not like.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so thank you. So, massage therapist, yes. And so you're commenting on how you see people who experience pain, and it might, some of that pain, it's related to not understanding what that experience is. It's a misinterpretation to some degree.
Yeah.
Not all pain is that way. I can appreciate that, and not trying to suggest that. But one way to look at it is it's a signal that I don't know how to interpret. And so broadening the perspective that I hold in terms of, can I interpret this in different ways? And you were commenting that some of the folks that you see might well be very lonely and experiencing pain.
And I find that people will cry during the
Right.
massage.
Right.
Which is a good thing because it's releasing.
Right. Right. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. So that idea of crying not being a bad thing, but actually being a very healing thing. And one of the things that I, you know, as a psychologist, you can imagine, I have a few people crying in my presence. I sometimes joke that it would be a conflict of interest of me for me to own shares in Kleenex. When I see people sort of wiping away tears, I invite them to grab a Kleenex, not because I want them to stop crying, but because I want to treat those tears with respect. And no offense, your sleeves are wonderful. They're wonderful and soft, I am sure. But just the idea that I have this Kleenex so that I can treat those tears with respect, because it's sending me a signal and it's healing. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
The question, if the body and the mind, or, yeah, and emotions, this stasis seeking.
Yes.
Why do we so often do the exact opposite of what we?
So sorry, that again? What's the
Why do we do it's just me. Why do we seem to do the exact opposite of what we need to bring this? Like we do too much. We stay
Ah,
up late.
oh, yeah, right.
We get into our caves as opposed to reaching. our
Yeah,
goals.
yeah. Okay, so perfect. So then, okay, so the question was, you know, if we are seeking homeostasis and our bodies and our brains are giving us signaling to bring us back into homeostasis, why is it that we often engage in behavior that's going to take us in the opposite direction? Well, that's a very good question. That is a very complicated answer because because there's lots of things in there, but some of them actually go back to the person behind you, and this is sometimes related to the patterns. And you know, we get engaged in behavior that is designed to not deal with the homeostasis. We don't look at it as homeostasis. We engage in pattern-based behavior to avoid that thing, but which, as is often the case in avoidance, only compounds it and makes it worse. So loneliness is actually a really good example. I am far more likely to withdraw if I am feeling lonely. And yet, as you pointed out, that is exactly the opposite of what I want to do if I'm going to bring myself back into homeostasis. Because I think this is why this term is so important. It's because we don't normally look at our body and brain signaling us to bring us back into homeostasis. We see these signals not as signals, but as functions, if you will, or you know, problems. And I want to avoid those things. And that's where patterns start to kick back in again. Right? So I think if we could see it as, you know, this is a signal trying to bring me back into homeostasis, it at least begs the question, what's the homeostasis that I am out of? Which might help us to be better able to engage in behavior or in thought patterns, because a lot of that happens at a cognitive level too, right? Thought patterns or behaviors that will actually bring us back into homeostasis. And I think that's one of the roles of mindfulness too, because if I have this a practice where I can actually build my awareness, this is one of the ways that I'll frequently describe mindfulness as well, that mindfulness is awareness and it's the ability to observe. Observe what? Well, observe anything that I choose. Observe myself. Observe my experience. Observe what that experience might be telling me or trying to tell me. And observe my reactions, which then gives me the option to decide how I want to respond. And respond in ways that might be more, to use Marshall Anahan's language, wise mind, rather than reactive. Does that make sense? Right? And I think this is one of the places where mindfulness can really be quite helpful. Okay, one more question, and then I want to get to a practice. Yes, please.
Okay, so I recently attended a pain conference, and the perspective that was being promoted is that we have that pattern of I'm having pain, I must be in danger, and then the reteaching is, wait a minute, I'm not in danger. I'm just familiar with this pattern that's repeating itself in my brain. So if I focus instead on, am I safe? It flips it over to the story.
Yes.
And so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So you were recently at a pain conference. Which pain conference was it, by the way?
That's the one.
Okay, that's okay. Just because I was presenting up in Edmonton at the Alberta Pain Society conference, that's why I was. Yeah. Okay. And so you were at a pain conference, and the idea that pain is trying to signal to me that I'm in danger or there's something as a threat. But if I can change the narrative, change the story to, am I safe? Right? Then it shifts my perspective and how I might interpret that signal. Is that fair?
Yes.
Right? Yeah, and I would agree. And I think part of where mindfulness plays a role there is it allows me a sense of awareness and that observational space to be able to appreciate, there's the signal, and there is me interpreting that as a threat. Can I create space for this other perspective? Can I entertain that? Not shoo away one or the other, but actually create some space where I can entertain both And then maybe start to shift the way that I place my attention away from threat, which is kind of how we're wired, threat detection systems, over to how am I safe? Right? So thank you. Yes, absolutely. And I think that that ability to be aware that this is the narrative that that is playing out. I will remind people, okay, so here we are. We're talking about this. We're talking about mindfulness, and we're talking about the nature of my relationship, right? With my relationship to pain, my relationship to my thoughts, my relationship to my emotions. Most people didn't know they had a relationship, let alone that you could modify that relationship. I mean, think about yourselves before you heard the word mindfulness. How many people realize that you actually have a relationship with your bodies, with your thoughts, with your emotions? Most people are busy out living it rather than reflecting on the relationship that you have. And so from a mindful perspective, it's about cultivating the awareness that I do have a relationship. I can relate to my body, to my sensations, to my thoughts, to my feelings and emotions. And the way that I relate can change the nature of my experience. And that's where I would like to start our practice. When I invite people to practice, I do lots of different ways, but maybe today what I'll do is I will invite you just for a moment, don't move. Don't move. Just caught you moving, I was kidding. Don't move. Just allow yourself to drop into this moment. And notice that you can be aware. If it helps, take a deep breath. Just be aware of yourself sitting in this chair in this moment. And you might notice that as you bring your awareness, you may be noticing some aspects of physical discomfort, which under normal circumstances, you would just naturally move to correct. But for this practice, can you just acknowledge, okay, there is some discomfort. Could be my back, could be my legs, could be my buttocks. Some people might be getting tired of hearing me and I'm a pain in your neck, whatever that might be, wherever the pain might be, just notice wherever that is. And then if you choose, move deliberately, move with awareness, and notice that you are changing the way that you are relating to your body. And you might notice various distractions. You might notice a voice outside. You might notice sensations that are coming from your body. You might notice thoughts about what I've already said, or about what's for dinner, and what happens next. Whatever those distractions might be, acknowledge them. They don't have to go away. I can still bring my attention back to my present moment, to my body, as I sit in this chair. Sometimes it is helpful to take a deep breath just to help gather one's attention so that you can then allocate it. You can place it with your body. Or create some space where you can observe your thinking. Create some space where you can observe a feeling. And just notice as you sit with that experience, you don't have to chase it away. And any thoughts that you might have about its pleasantness or unpleasantness are a function of your mind's judging the moment. Just set that aside. Just set that aside. And come back to the sensations, come back to what you were placing your attention with. If it helps, take another deep breath. You can hear the voices outside the door, but they don't have to go away. I can still bring my attention back to my body in this chair. Feet on the ground, legs on the seat, back leaning against the back of your chair. I can still bring my attention back again. And as you do that, maybe just make a mental note. What do you notice? What do you observe? What sensations? What thoughts? What feelings? Just note that. Fatigue, discomfort, the thought, what's for dinner? And then come back to the moment. Come back to sitting. Legs on the seat. Feet on the ground. What we call bare sensations. Just noting when your attention leaves and just gently bringing it back. It's not a bad thing. It's not something that I'm doing wrong. This is how the mind works. And I'm familiarizing myself with that. I'm learning. I'm observing. And I can bring my attention back to the moment. Feet on the ground. Legs on the chair. And then at a moment of your choosing, taking another deep breath. Using that breath to gather your attention from wherever it was, thoughts, feelings, future, past, or present. And then when you exhale, bringing your attention back to this chair, back to this room, back to this group. And if your eyes were closed, maybe just opening them, letting me know that you're back. Okay. Anybody would like to share what you noticed? Any observations that you made in that practice? Felt good? Yeah? Okay. Felt good? Glad.
I always feel good when I do in these kind of settings,
Yes.
but it is when I have conflicts or challenges,
Yes.
that's when, it's hard for me to.
Yes. What makes it-
That's why I argue with my wife, it's hard.
What makes it hard?
I don't know, my automatic or conditioned behavior just trumps mindfulness practice or my commitment to mindfulness, right? I mean, I become reactive and then I react.
I become reactive. So in conflict, I become reactive.
And after the fight, I without response, that let it be.
Right, right. So, and then I end up responding in ways that I'm perhaps not
Mm.
happy with, or it's not consistent with my values.
So, yeah.
Is that fair?
Exactly, yeah, you're right, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So your comment earlier was taking it from the conceptual and bringing it down into the practical, right?
Yeah.
I don't tell people what to do, but you might consider. Okay, maybe I'm going to unpack that a little bit. I make a distinction between formal mindful practice and informal mindful practice. Lots of different ways of making that distinction, but one of them is formal practice. We've got time set aside. I might do it at the same time in the day, or I might do it for a specific period of time. It's a specific practice that I might engage in. Some very real benefits that come from that. Informal practice. So one of the things that I'll do when I'm talking about mindfulness with somebody that I'm working with is I might go for a mindful walk. And I'll tell them that I like mindful walking because walking is something that we do with some regularity. And so what it means is that when I am going for a walk, even if I don't start out with the intent of being mindful, if I catch myself in that moment, I can then say, oh, how about I just pay attention to this next step? How about I pay attention to the next few steps? And this becomes an opportunity for me to bring mindfulness into my daily life in a less formal way. I think one of the benefits of doing that is if I can find ways of sprinkling that through my day, it might make mindfulness more available to me, regardless of what it is that I am contending with in that moment. Some of those moments might be conflict. And it might help me to remember, oh, this might be a good time to be mindful. And then if I can bring myself into the moment in a very intentional way, at the very least, I might be able to observe some of those reactions, those patterns. And I can build my awareness around that. And maybe even acknowledge that, okay, I'm a human being interacting, and this is a part of how I have come to react. But maybe there's some space for something alternate. A different way that I'd like to respond now. That might at least give me a different outcome. Perhaps be more consistent with my values, how I would like to be in this conflictual situation, how I would like to be in this relationship with this other person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have to agree on that. Yeah, I mean, it's not that I did not have any benefits, but
Yes.
I have seen a huge difference in the way in which I have been responding to situations.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
I have the mind on my phone.
Yeah, right.
One of things. Yeah,
Yes.
so it does help.
Yes.
I have to totally agree.
Yes, perfect. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that observation too. Yeah. Any other observations?
I got very hot.
You got very hot. Yeah. Generally speaking?
Yeah, it might have been the tea.
Yes, maybe. Yes,
There's just Hush.
yeah. So you notice the physiology of that.
Is, you know,
Yeah, okay, perfect, yeah. What did you notice when you noticed that you were getting hot?
I noticed that I noticed.
Yeah, perfect, just sat.
Christy runs
Right,
2 months.
yes, being able to be with that sensation
Yeah.
and not run from it there. Yes. Yes, so thank you. So not running from it, not needing to, take a scarf off or something like that, right? Although I could, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a choice. And this is one of the other things that I think mindfulness brings is choicefulness. Right? The ability to choose rather than just react and do as I normally would, which goes back to the earlier point, which is maybe it is those reactions that actually take me further away from homeostasis. Even though the signal is taking me, telling me, go back this way. It is my reactions and my automated behavior take me this way. And maybe I get to be choiceful about that. Thank you. Yeah.
One way I think when we went to practice, it remind me when I go hiking and I'm alone.
Yes.
And I just realize when I'm going and when I'm alone, it's me, my feet, and then back.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the loneliness is good or not, but I think at that moment, I think it's the best time because that's your
Yes.
your
Yes. So when you're hiking and it's your body and your environment, right? And in the comment, I don't know if that loneliness is good or not. I would actually suggest that's a great example of where loneliness and being alone, not the same. I can be alone and still be very comfortable with myself, with experiencing whatever it is that I'm experiencing and not feel lonely. I can be in a crowd and be intensely lonely. Right? So a wonderful example of where here I am in nature and my perspective, my perception of this is not one of discrepancy. It is not one of something is not right or there's a threat. It is one of comfort and ease. Fair? And then what I find there is not lonely. Connectedness, even though there's no one around me. I'm connected with nature. Thank you. Yeah. How am I doing, Christine? Yeah, okay.
Typically when we wrap up, the being left is your top 3 that you would like to leave.
Okay, top 3 that, okay, perfect, okay.
If that serves for that.
Yes. Yes, okay, top 3, okay.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, yeah, right, yeah. Yeah.
Be mindful.
Yeah, exactly. Drop into this moment, yes. That's gonna be one of them, that's gonna be one. Top 3, social homeostasis. The practice of mindfulness as being a way of building my ease with myself, with whatever it is that I find when I tune in. And mindful relating being one way that I can also enhance the quality of my relationships, being present with others. Actually, I'm glad that you said that because I didn't talk a lot about that one. Maybe if I got a couple more minutes left, I'm gonna unpack that one a little bit. That idea of mindfulness being a way of being able to be connected with others. Because I think that we can be with others and not feel connected. And so mindfulness and being present and being aware of my own internal piece, but also the person that I'm with, and being able to be fully present in that way, being a deeper way of connecting with that person. How many times have we been in conversation with somebody and we've only been partially present. Maybe not even present at all. Maybe I missed completely what the other person was saying, but at least partially present. By the way, normal. Not necessarily helpful, but normal. And so mindfulness might be one way of being able to practice that ability to be present. To be present with what that other person is saying, telling me, sharing with me, being able to hold that and let it be known that I am holding that. Through my attention, through the way that I am attentive to them. This is, I think, one of the dilemmas that we face with social media. You know, it's like a blast email, right? But it's not really connecting. It's, okay, I get to know what you're up to, but you're not really connecting with me. You're just sort of sending it out into the ether. And I'm one of the people that will receive it. So it's a good way of catching up with people, but it's not really connecting. I'm not here to bash social media, merely to say that it serves some functions, but we ought to be careful about knowing what function it serves so that we don't try to get it to meet needs that it's just not built to meet. Right? And so mindfulness being a way that I can be more present with the other person that I am connecting and communicating with, even when there is conflict. Which, if you have meaningful relationships, there is going to be some disagreement and conflict. Being present with them, being present with that, accepting that, responding rather than reacting. My big three. Is that fair? Okay. Thank you. Thank you all. Appreciate it. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invite.